Okay, you can title your notes Government Structure, and the question today is how is the government structured and why? But what I have here, this title here, is kind of the name of the structure. So government structure can be your title, and if someone asked what is the government structure, you could say it's the Madisonian system. But the deeper question is how is it set up and why is it set up that way? So we'll go through some notes. A lot of it's building off of last class period over the principles of the Constitution. So there will be some repetition, but hopefully a more in-depth exploration of those principles. And we'll look at sort of what that structure looks like and then why. So it's named the Madisonian system because we could say James Madison is the architect. He thought extensively and defended extensively the Constitution in his Federalist Papers. Okay, so before drawing out what this structure would look like, let's think about the goals in mind. We want a government that is going to prevent any group, any person from becoming too powerful, because if someone has too much authority, they might become tyrannical and they might then infringe upon your rights, your freedoms. So we need to limit the government to protect individual liberty. And if you'll recall, the whole Constitution limits government. This is the rule book for the government. And then we also want a government that's going to make good decisions. You know, we want well thought out, fully deliberated legislation passed by Congress. We want policies that are good for this country. And we do like the idea of democracy, that the people should have access to the government, should be able to control the government. So how are we going to achieve all of those? That's kind of what the structure Madison comes up with, strives to do. So what structure or what set of rules do we put in the rule book so as to reach these goals? One basic thing, our government is a republic. We are a democratic republic. What it means to be a republic, notice rep, R-E-P, it's that we elect representatives. So when we go vote, we don't get to vote directly on legislation, except for propositions. But most of the time when we vote, we are voting for a person who will then make a vote in the state legislature or in the U.S. Congress on our behalf, and they will vote on potential laws. So we elect people to represent us. And that makes sense. This is a large country. A lot of us have day jobs. We don't know everything about everything. So we elect someone and then we sort of trust their expertise. If we don't like what they do, we always have the opportunity to vote them out of office. So just a reminder, we're not really a direct democracy. Occasionally we get to vote on propositions. Propositions are the rare instances where we get to vote directly on laws. So if you wanted to say what type of government we are a republic, and this adjective describes that republic. We are a democratic republic. It's the idea that we do have control through elections, but our elections are indirect, the way we elect representatives. So we can elect people to our city council, to our state legislature, to be our governor, our lieutenant governor, to be president. We have a variety of offices that we can vote for. And this is also a good point to make note that these are, when we talk about democracy or republic, those are forms of government. The two major political parties in this country have adopted those names, not necessarily related to these meanings, but we know that we value democratic ideas and Republican ideals. So the Democratic and Republican parties are not really related to these forms of government. And when you see it written, if it's lowercase, then we're talking about the form of government. If it's uppercase, we're talking about one of the parties. Okay, so last class when we did the 6 principles, we talked about federalism and how it divides power between two governments. That can be really fantastic because there's a lot of responsibility for governing a nation. So we can split things up where the federal government does some things and the state governments do other things. But Madison had to address the relationship between those two governments. So what you have here is a chart of 3 types of systems with multiple levels of government. So here on the left you have a unitary system, and that would be where the voters elect people to the central government. Okay, so the central government gets its authority from the voters, and then the central government can appoint the officials to the state and local governments. So in a unitary system, which government has more power? The state and local governments or the central government? it would be the central government, because all the authority from the state governments is derived from the central government. So even though this puts state and local government at the top here, that doesn't mean it's the most powerful. It's really the central government in a unitary system that wields more power. So in a unitary system, you're going to have a really strong federal government and state governments that are dependent on that central government, that are subservient. On the other side, a confederation, it's the opposite. The voters elect people to the local government, to the state government, and then that government gives its authority and creates the central government. In this case, it's the state and local governments that wield enormous power over the central government. So this is a bit of the Goldilocks. In a unitary system, the central government's too strong. In a confederation, the local government's too strong. So with a federation, what we have are the voters in the middle, and they get to elect people to the central government, and they elect people to the state governments. And you, the voter, you, the citizen, lives under both governments. Both governments make laws over you, both governments collect taxes, and generally they do different things, but they might have overlap in what they do. So in this system, the real question is, which government is more powerful, the federal or the state government? In a sense, they're equal. Or we might say, in some instances, the federal government's more powerful, and in other instances, the state government's more powerful. But what I want you to note here is ambiguity. Another thing we could note, if you want to write it down here, is that 95% of the law you live under is state law. So while you might think the federal government is federal and it goes across the country, it must be more powerful, your day-to-day life is governed more by your state government. Okay, so a little more on federalism. I have a chart here. You don't need to copy the whole thing. But what I want to show is, with federalism having two levels of government, we can sort of divide up the powers, or the responsibilities. So national powers, also exclusive to the national government, these exclusive powers are things only the federal government can do. The two you should take down in your notes is declare war. States can't do that. And also coin money, meaning make our currency. So your money, whether it's $1, a quarter, $100 bill, it's all says the United States of America. So the federal government has exclusive power to do the things here on the left. And then the reserved powers, or state powers, make sure here you get both names. And you can write 10th. These come from the 10th Amendment. The reserved powers are all the rest. The rest. Anything that the federal government can't do, really, generally, then is left to the states to decide. So let me give you two that you should write down here. State powers include conducting elections. No election is a national election. Even when we vote for the president, it's technically a state election. So they conduct elections and set up the requirements and rules for how those work. And a second one is the license requirements. Your states issue your marriage licenses, your driver's licenses, and your professional licenses. Like if you're a lawyer or a doctor, you get that certification, that licensing from your state. So this is really good because there's a lot of things the government has to do, and if the federal government had to do every single little thing, it would maybe have too much power or too much burden. So we leave it to the states to run some of these things. There is some overlap, things both governments can do. We call those concurrent powers. For example, they both get to tax you, and they both get to impose laws on you. So let's copy down collect taxes and define crimes and set punishments. Okay, so they divide up powers, and that helps. But I also now want to look at another implication of setting up your system this way. If you look up here in the left corner, that is a map of the United States. But what you see is each state has imposed on it its state flag. So federalism allows for us to be unified as a nation, but for each state to maintain its own identity, and for each state to create laws that reflect the people of that state's set of values and culture. So that's really helpful, especially when we think about early American history and westward expansion. Washington, D.C. was not necessarily equipped to understand the problems and concerns of those living way out in the West. So by allowing states to make their own laws, then the people of that state, in a sense, can have more popular sovereignty. Remember that principle from last lecture. So the states can have more popular sovereignty within by being allowed to have such extensive powers separate from the federal government. And so while no one government has total power over you, you do really live under your state law. And if you ever move to another state, when you get to that state, you'll discover just how different it is. Culture might be different, values might be different, people might seem different, and certainly the laws are different, especially as you get older. If you're in a profession, and then you go to another state, you might discover you have to do a whole slew of other things to get right with that state's professional requirements. And finally, this also allows us to experiment. States can serve as laboratories where you can try something out in a state, and if it doesn't work, if it turns out that that policy was not a good policy, well, then it only affects that state, and the other 49 states are sort of untouched. But if a state tries out a policy and it works really well, and the data shows that that policy was good for that state, well, maybe other states will follow suit, or the federal government will follow suit. So let me give you a couple examples. Let's think about Obamacare. The Affordable Care Act, passed in 2010 and signed into law by Obama, passed by Congress in 2010, signed into law. The Affordable Care Act is also known as Obamacare. And that's because he really pushed for it. He really lobbied for it in Congress. Well, that idea, that plan for how to reform health care was not entirely new. Barack Obama is a smart guy, but he did not come up with it all on his own. What he did is he took it. And followed the model that was done in another state. Another state in our union tried out a health care reform plan. And then after it rolled out, when you looked at the state, more people had gotten health insurance. And when you polled people of the state, they were overwhelmingly happy with this health reform program in their state. So when Obama took it to Congress, he didn't just say, I have this idea and I think it'll work. He'll say, look at what was tried in the state, look at the data, more people did get health insurance, and it seemed effective in that state. Now that state was Massachusetts, and the funny thing here is it was rolled out in Massachusetts while Mitt Romney was governor, and at the time they called it Romneycare. So just kind of interesting when you think about the 2012 election where Mitt Romney had to challenge Barack Obama and especially criticized Obamacare. And then finally, as far as states as laboratories, some states are trying out legalization of marijuana, and so those are laboratories. Other states are looking at Colorado and Washington to determine, is it worth the tax revenue? It's not just about how much money does that generate. We're going to also have to look at what happens to unemployment rates. We're going to have to look at what happens, are there more fatalities on the road? Are there higher costs or higher burdens on our medical industry? So what are the other effects of this policy? And probably 10, 15 years from now, we'll have an idea of how that policy affected the state. We've got a good list of pros and cons, and other states might follow suit, or if it fails, at least those states didn't follow suit right away, and that experiment happened in one state and only one state. Okay, so separation of powers. Why don't you pause this and copy the chart? Okay, so another principle we went over, this is the idea that you have three branches with distinct powers, and you have the names of the institutions here. So the legislative branch for the federal government, that institution's name is Congress. And then all 50 states have their own legislative branches, but we don't call them Congresses. That would get confusing. So Congress is reserved just for the federal government. And we call those other ones state legislatures. Same thing here. The president is in charge of the executive branch of the federal government. And for a state, there is still an executive branch that enforces state law, and the head of that is the governor. And then the Supreme Court heads the whole federal judiciary, because there are federal courts throughout the whole country, but at the top of that structure is the Supreme Court. Texas also has its state courts where state criminal and civil cases occur, and then at the top of that is the state Supreme Court. So click to the next video.